What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Staff and FaculTEA Sessions, where we spill the tea on real experiences in higher education. We're your hosts, Anna and Chelsea. And as always, we don't spill the tea to gossip, we spill it to transform.
That's right. And before we get started, we have a quick reminder. This podcast is a space for truth-telling and community building. We are not offering legal or mental health advice, and the stories shared here are personal and don't represent every individual or institution. We also want to remind you to subscribe and follow the pod on YouTube and Spotify. And please join our community on Instagram and TikTok at staff_faculty sessions pod. And we're also trying to use BlueSky.
So let's get it started. We always want to be human first before we get down to business. Yeah. So let's start with a check-in. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
I think both of our hearts are with LA right now, in particular, Los Angeles, rising, representing.
Yeah.
And that's really spreading. I know that other states and spaces have been also standing up and forming those human chains and putting our bodies in front to represent and protect our migrant siblings, our families, our abuelas, our kids, like so deep, right? So yeah. I know that's weighing heavy. And when we think about that hope discipline, again, that Mariam Kaba talks about, right? This is part of that, right? I feel like this kind of hope, probably since 2020.
Yeah.
With the movement for Black lives and people really showing up, saying no more.
Agreed. And yeah, I mean, as an immigrant myself, and even though I'm a naturalized citizen, you know, that anxiety still is very present. And I'm grateful to see people really like finally being activated. I wish it hadn't taken this long, and I wish it didn't mean that we had to allow such atrocities to begin, but the Gestapo's out here and we're ready to stop them. So that is very invigorating and hope-inducing, which is great because we needed that.
Yeah. And I think about, I was thinking about that, this morning I saw a video of a Black teacher, a young Black man who is in a school that's situated right next to a school that serves a lot of brown folks. And it was their graduation day. And I fucking showed up at that school. And he was sobbing, right? And just the pain and thinking about like that growing solidarity with the intersections, especially I think of Black abolitionists that have been warning about the growing police state. When we think about, most of us have lived in a world where ICE and DHS didn't exist, right? This was all post 9/11 shit, violence, sadness, immigrant trying to frame brown folks as terrorists, essentially. And so for people to really be, hopefully acknowledging that that's what it is. And I'm wishing healing on, because when you look at who works for Border Patrol, when you think about like how colonized our people have been, right? Yeah. And that sickness, right? And so I'm also praying for healing for them, that they can see, right, the ways in which they are committing violence on themselves.
Yeah, which I think is something that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah.
And not just in that context. Unfortunately, I think this really ties into a lot of what we're going to discuss in today's episode as well. For today, we're focusing on the way that the system is set up to protect power and to villainize anyone who questions power. So yeah, that's really resonating for me as we're speaking about that and kind of how it connects to every part of our lives and where it shows up, constantly, and how if you don't do something to address that issue, it just keeps getting more embedded in you and, more embodied in you. And
just following orders.
We don't want that. So,
I'm just following orders, right? Like, what does that look like when we when we normalize complicity around harm so deeply that like, where is the line, right? And so I'm excited to dive into it. And we're talking about higher ed, right? But I really want people to be drawing those broader connections because it is all interconnected. And you and I talk about this a lot. Like, we can't talk about systems, whether it be higher ed, the nonprofit, like whatever it is, right? Without talking about power.
everything is political
Mm-hmm.
and everything comes back to power and money.
Yep. So
here we are with the tea.
Let's go.
I also want to point out, I'm noticing that my shirt is only showing the anarchist part. So I want to show the bottom. It's calisthenics.
Yep.
It's one of my shirts from Vital Vita Vendors. And this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Practice,
Building the muscle.
practice. You got to practice. Start breaking some rules. This is not legal advice again, but if you're not practicing your resistance, it's going to be too late.
Yeah.
So we just encourage you to jump on in and figure out where you fit in, because everyone has a role.
Yeah. And I love, if we can get a little personal, I just want to say, I love how Anna's partner, as she's been really helping him build that muscle, right? Yeah. Because again, for so many of us that grow up in whatever system it is, it can be organized religion, it could be whatever, where like we're taught to just follow orders and to say yes. Mm-hmm. So if you don't practice saying no or standing up to the little shit, you're not going to be able to stand up to the big shit. And we're in big shit time. Yeah. So,
and that's why I like the calisthenics.
Again, scared and do it. It's practicing.
Because
right?
You're not going to just go lift 200 pounds. You got to work your way up, you know, and depending on where you're starting, you might be able to start at 5 pounds and you might be able to start at 50 pounds.
Yep.
And either way, it's great. It's about working the muscle and being part of the resistance. Yep. Whatever way makes sense.
Yep. So say it in the meeting can be one way to just start, right? Yeah. Be scared and do it anyways.
Okay, we'll get off the soapbox.
Sorry, we went a little long there. But on the subject of leadership and accountability and like starting to flex those muscles, right?
She means leadership.
I use that word loosely, but thinking about like where that started, right? Like that origin story. What was the first time where you kind of like had to bear witness that like leadership and accountability were not things that were necessarily connected, right? That there was a failure that happened. And what did you learn in that moment about power, about how power operates? What did you learn about yourself? And so I've been like going deep again, like into my schemas, my first real job, you know, and then my next real, I feel like career, which became my career in higher ed. There were two stories that are very connected. And I don't know if you want to start off, because I feel like I've been talking, or if you want me to start it off.
Yeah, I think I'd like you to start.
I'm ready to go, y'all.
Get it. Get it.
I've been sleeping on this. I've been eating on this. And I'm a little under the weather. I've been sick. So if my thoughts are not totally clear, well, you understand. So my first real job, so I think I've shared a little bit here. I was a teen mom in the context of a really sort of violent relationship. I had a daughter at 17. And so a lot of my life experiences are really framed around like gender, motherhood, abuse, abandonment of women and children, frankly. So my first real job was at a major shoe retailer. I'm sure y'all can figure this one out, black and white stripes. And I worked, now there's a ladies side of that, but I worked on the male side. I was 18 years old. I had a 1-year-old. Again, I was still super, super damaged and struggling. And we had a male manager in his piece. He was married with, I think, 4 children. And this was my first real experience with like sexual violence and sexual harassment and like learning how to say no, or at least bear witness when I felt like things were wrong. And so he was like hitting on all of us. And we were all, again, not an accident. He hired young, maybe like conventionally attractive women, right, in his mind. And vulnerable women. He knew I was vulnerable. I told my whole story, you know, which I probably shouldn't have done, but I needed that job. So he hired me and he was like really inappropriate with me. It started with small comments. Long story long, he tried to have a sexual relationship with me. And I resisted. I said no. I was punished in a lot of ways. I was forced to work with him by myself in evenings, right? The closing shifts and things where I felt really unsafe. And later on, I found out that he hired another young woman about my age, and he ended up having a relationship with her. She finally reported. She had told me first. And so I was just kind of like there trying to support her. It all went down, went to HR, all that stuff. And before we knew it, he was gone, right? And so in my mind, I'm like, he was fired. Like, cool. He was held accountable. I didn't have that language at the time, but it was like, he was fired. And then years later, so I ended up kind of becoming like a little bit of a training person where we would open additional stores. And so I'd get to go work in those other stores in our region. And so later on, it wasn't uncommon for you to call another store, say in a neighboring community like Oxnard, 45 minutes away to see if they had a size in something. And I called that store and he answered the phone. And I remember just collapsing, being like, oh my God, they just transferred his ass. And it was a better store and a bigger store. So he was making more money. So he was rewarded for that behavior.
Not surprising, unfortunately.
No, it's textbook, right? And so I remembered like feeling so much heartbreak because, I made myself very vulnerable to testify, to like tell the truth about what was happening to us. And he got rewarded and I felt punished because then once I shared, anyways, fast forward to my experience in higher education, a very similar thing happened. I worked in a program that was serving women like me. And we were all young, vulnerable, single moms of color. I was like the white passing one in our group and it was all Latinas and we were all really vulnerable. And we had a male supervisor who preying on all of us, would take us out for drinks and all kinds of stuff as like young women and hitting on all of us, whatever. And, I worked there with a couple of my friends and we were all like coming out of the neighborhood and whatever. We're like, fuck no. They just like, nah, bro. But other women were susceptible, right? And he ended up having a relationship with our secretary and then just who was a young mom and then just like all kinds of other stuff that he was doing. And he finally got caught taking photos of our bodies. We had been moved up to a different campus and we were all in this tiny room together. I'm talking like 10 by 10. We called it the fishbowl. And there were all these file cabinets in there. So it was like him and like 3 young women working in there all day. And he would often be on his phone. And these were the days of flip phones. And he apparently forgot to silence his phone this time. And we had been reporting things. Nothing really went anywhere. But this time you heard his phone go off where he was taking photos.
The shutter sound.
The shutter sound. And he was taking photos of our bodies while we were like bending over to get files. And so I was the last one to know because I was kind of his right hand and I had moved on to the university at this point. So it was all these other young women that were still students in that institution and were, again, very marginalized. This was like our whole livelihood. And so they came to me and told me, and then I encouraged them to report and we all went through, HR and all the stuff. Well, he was put on administrative leave and it turned out he had done a bunch of other things. And so he was forced to resign for a lot of the other improprieties, including embezzlement and things like that.
No big deal.
No big deal. But the reckoning was never came around what he did to us. And no leadership ever showed up to be like, are y'all okay? Like that was a huge violation, right? Again, we trusted this person with our livelihoods with so much, right? And there was never any acknowledgement of the harm and the hurt and how that became so much of my origin story in institutions in higher education, serving vulnerable, mostly women and children. And we're going to talk later about like the vicarious trauma and secondary harm and all that. But those are my 2 very real, visceral, and these both happened by the time I was like in my mid-20s. And it never ended. So that's that.
I've heard this story before and it's still impactful every time because it's sick. And the fact that like it sticks with you so vividly and like the impact from the lack of response and care.
Yeah.
Because let's be real, the motivation is probably the money.
Absolutely.
Not y'all, and like that's devastating.
And then we all sort of got pitted against one another in the process, right?
Of course.
So that's what it looks like.
Oppression doesn't work if we're not fighting each other. Punch up, people, punch up. But yeah, I don't know what to say except for I'm sorry. And I wish there was more that I could say to make it feel better, to make it feel hopeful.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this is something that's still happening.
Absolutely.
On a daily basis.
Honestly, it was one of those formative experiences that I think you and I have talked about, like that I know it's crazy and we never should have had to go through that. And women are still going through this all day, every day. Non-binary people, but like it made me the kind of woman that like would have shown up for those young women.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
totally.
I was like, oh, hell no. Like I'm not going to continue to let this go in silence. Right. So I at least appreciate that I was able to become the kind of woman that would protect young Chelsea, young, I'm not going to say any names, but like all the young women in there. And I still have relationships with those women, and they're all doing badass work.
That's great.
So,
yeah. Sometimes the trauma is what really forces you to learn and grow. I hope to one day live in a world where that's not the case.
Why it's not necessary.
For now, I guess that's the silver lining. I don't necessarily have one specific idea, but I think what came to my mind was my time living and working in res life. And there's a lot of conflict that arises in those in those roles. We have students that are living together, and we all live with people. We've all lived with people, family, friends, partners, all the things. And there's lots of conflict that comes around.
Yeah.
And I think one of the pieces that kind of came up for me around that was the way that we handled some of the conflicts that would arise and connected to power in a different way. It wasn't necessarily our staff doing this or like highlighting this dynamic, but oftentimes when we would have an issue arise between two roommates, usually the student who was being harmed was the one who had to be relocated, and we couldn't relocate the person who was causing harm, and oftentimes the dynamics present in that, involved marginalized identity groups, particularly the racial component of it. Gender generally didn't come up as much because people generally lived in, same gender settings. But yeah, I think that was a big learning moment for me to see. And me, I've always had this like need for justice. Yeah. And so like, I've always looked at things through that lens.
Yep.
And like pushing back and being like, what do you mean we have to make her move? Like, she didn't do anything.
Yeah.
She's being punished. She's being called names. She's being bullied in her room. Like, I don't understand. And just recognizing, sometimes, the person in the room who had access to more resources and who instilled fear because they might sue us or whatever the thing is.
Do you know who my daddy is?
I know, exactly. I always called him on it. I was like, don't pull that on me.
Yeah.
I know your dad's a dentist. We don't care about that. But yeah, I guess what that really kind of taught me is justice isn't always on the side that it needs to be.
Yeah.
We often have to make concessions to address the situation. And like, how do you rationalize that in a survival setting? Again, my housing is tied to my work and my schooling at the time when I was in grad school and then moving forward. But yeah, I think just like the concept of the power dynamics that we don't want to talk about that aren't explicitly named, and how that often means the person who's holding the power doesn't get the accountability. Somehow the accountability falls on the victim, on the survivor, on the person doing the reporting. And then unfortunately, that thread has continued to be very consistently present. Now, as I have more time in higher ed and, in professional worlds, unfortunately, it's something that I'm very used to seeing. But again, I think learning some of those things early on in, my life really shaped the way that I show up in spaces, whether they're professional spaces or not. And help me kind of find my voice and take the risks, feel the fear, and do it anyway, because I realized like, if we aren't advocating for each other and ourselves, the system's always going to win. So it's a lot to ponder there.
I think we went into this in our last episode. We were talking about housing, right? As like this basic foundational need, this like seeking safety. Like, how do people even aspire to learn when they don't have that basic need met? And our people do it all the time. Our students, our workers, our people who travel, who commute an hour each way to show up to be abused. But it's like, there's so much complexity there and so many layers to that. And I think when I think about you and I and a lot of people that like we share time with, I think about how that so many of the times, like bearing witness to those institutional failures sort of had made us rise up as informal leaders. Because we're like, okay, if I don't have any control over the system, I don't have any power like in this arena, right? And they're always going to control the levers, right? And the law is not going to be, because the bar is so high when it comes to the law, right? The legal implications. Like, how can I at least affirm this person in their experiences so they know they're not crazy and they're not wrong? Like, you ain't wrong. This is a really messed up outcome and I'm sorry. And here are some things that we can do. But like, I want you to know that you're not wrong and that you're not crazy. And just that is where so many leaders miss the mark.
Yeah, it's the lack of humanity and everything has to be sterilized.
Yep.
And, what is our PR? What is our presentation? How do we check the box?
Yep.
How do we win an award for some program? Nobody needs to know that in the background, we're actually causing harm on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And we know it and we don't care.
Yeah.
Because it's just little old so-and-so.
Yeah. Or it's like Mental Health Awareness Month, where it's like mental health awareness. So we're going to present that there are some good things happening with some good people who are doing good work. But if you can't address what's underneath, right? If you can't actually hold people accountable when they are inflicting harm and pain and all the gaslighting and all that shit, then it doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything.
All right. So we're going to get into it. And we want to start with sharing some grounding in what the public discussion is in the higher ed sphere. So what we're going to be talking about is how HR is not your friend. Oftentimes we're told, go report it, go report it. That's how you resolve things. And unfortunately, in my experience and what I've seen from others, that's not always the case.
Yeah. And there are so many indications, right? Again, we're talking about personal stories, but there was a Chronicle article recently on training fatigue and how we're seeing how many institutional responses are frankly just performative. They exist to limit liability. They exist to protect the institution, not support the people within it.
Take a second on that, because
let it marinate.
Protecting the institution is the top priority.
Yep.
I don't even know what to say.
So what happens with the public trust?
It's tanking. There's been articles written about that as well. And I think not just with higher education, we're seeing this kind of all over the place. But people are tired of empty apologies.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of what you say all the time. Apologies without changed behavior is manipulation. And we're done with that.
Yeah. And it's accountability theater, right? I know the Oscar goes too. You like me, you really like me. No, we don't. So like, is restorative justice even possible? Is any kind of justice possible in institutions that are meant to protect power, protect the interest of power? There's a quote, many of these trainings aren't about healing. They're about limiting liability. So that's from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And again, we've seen this play out over and over again. Your stories are telling us about this in real time over and over again. We've lived this. So keep submitting those stories, because again, this is all about us speaking truth and saying, hey, leadership, what are we going to do about this? We can fix this. What are you going to do if there's no public trust? So we're going to stir the pot a little bit. These are our listener stories. This is what y'all are telling us. We're going to bring in some stories from our listeners that pull all this together.
Because it's too easy for people to write off one story.
Yep.
Right? Oh, that was just a once-off thing. It's not.
Yeah.
We are sharing these stories because we want you to see the pattern.
Yep.
That is what's incredibly important. So our first story comes from T-spiller number 1, who was dealing with a toxic environment and toxic leadership, who repeatedly filed reports and had HR do nothing. One of the quotes that stood out to us from this person's story was, quote, "There was no protection for staff, even when concerns were raised repeatedly through the proper channels." And so that really kind of cements this idea of pretending like there's systems to address the situation. But in reality, what's often being done is gathering information to then weaponize against you.
Yeah. And again, when we talk about them like controlling the levers, right? The policies were weaponized to suppress dissent, right? Those BPs, those APs, all those things where you're like, well, who does this apply to? HR never intervened. No leadership intervened. And a direct quote from this listener story was administrators weaponized policy to suppress dissent. HR protected them, not us. And again, we're hearing this over and over again.
And our third story that we're using to ground our discussion today is from a person who was working in a DEI office, who was constantly being gaslit, and ultimately that led to their burnout. They currently are choosing to stay for students, but this person shared with us that leadership gaslights us constantly. Faculty and staff are leaving in waves. I stay for the students, but I'm at my limit. And so I think all of those really kind of encompass what our intentions are with this episode, to really just expose the patterns that are happening, to make it clear this is not a one-time thing.
Yeah.
It's a consistent thing that's going on everywhere. And I'm sure you all know because you're here watching this podcast.
Yeah. So we kind of were going into some like discussion prompts for our own sort of framing and thinking about this. Again, we spend so much time outside of filming to like do a deep dive on these issues because again, they're so layered, they're so complex. It's a whole ass onion. It makes you cry. But thinking about like, what does it mean to stay in a place that's hurting you because you care for others within it?
And personally attacked.
And this is like, again, this applies to work. This applies to our personal lives. I want to name again that every single person we've met with has been either a woman or a gender nonconforming person. A lot of young people that are really being hurt by people who they've looked to as mentors, as people who cared for them. Again, having this experience personally and watching it with so many of our colleagues that as a student, feeling cared for, not perfectly, but feeling cared for and seen, and then becoming a colleague and like all of that goes away. Now I'm a problem when I'm saying the same things. And again, those things were also often erased and problematized for students, but it's different when you become an employee and if you're in a place where you had trusted adults. And so like, why does the support always come with conditions or strings, like to my personhood, right? To our value set? What does it mean to stay in that? What the erosion that happens for you as a person? And then the things that we're steeping on. What does repair or transformation look like? Like, what would that look like? When we're dreaming of new worlds, why can't we dream of new worlds and more life-affirming systems within higher education? And I think I had a lot of hope for this. I feel like, especially with COVID, right? It's like the white lash after the movement for Black lives, right? Well, I know we kind of like almost treated you like you were human for like a little bit, but fuck that noise, go sit in your crusty office for 10 hours a day being abused. And
yeah, I mean, it's the control, right? And I think that's the piece that as a neurodivergent person is really hard to navigate because I don't care who you are.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
If you're wrong, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring it up. And I don't think that's a bad thing. If I'm wrong, I want you to bring it up to me.
Yep.
Because that's how I learn.
Yep.
I wish that there was more capacity for people to take constructive feedback, to take moments to like self-reflect and to recognize we're all going to make mistakes. That's a normal thing. And when you make a mistake and you take a moment to be like, sorry, y'all, I fucked up. Let's fix this. How do we fix this? Right? Like, what can I do to repair? That changes the dynamic in such a powerful way because either way, you made a mistake and we know it's not a secret.
Everybody knows.
So just deal with it head on.
Yeah.
And it works so much better that way. And I think that's part of what I want to talk about a little bit with this concept of like support and what that looks like, what repair and transformation could be. Truthfully, it's all going to start with the individual person taking a moment to just own that, like, I am not perfect.
Yeah.
I'm going to make mistakes. And then the community will respond, hopefully, ideally. Again, this is what we're hoping to move toward. Yeah, you done fucked up, but let's talk about how we fix that. Right? So like me showing up in my humility and vulnerability and accountability, working with folks in communal spaces to be like, how do we repair? Is there repair possible here? And sometimes there might not be. People be doing some egregious things, and sometimes that's not possible, but to at least even be able to like clear the air and have somebody know, like, I know I did wrong and there may not be any coming back from here, but I want you to know, like, I see you and I know what I've done.
Yeah. And how do we prevent this from happening in the future?
But that seems a little advanced.
It's wild because I remember sort of in my final days of when I was just kind of like begging for help and falling apart, like in public, like crying all the time. Like it was so obvious that like after so many years, like I was not okay. And I was like begging, right? And I had this conversation with like a new supervisor, and there were all these things that had happened interim after interim. And, you know, there's all this mess with leadership, right? And so many of us were just trying to hold things together, especially the senior staff that had been there and had relationships with students and with our colleagues. And I remember I had this whole conversation like about accountability because there had been some things that like had fallen through the cracks that were real, you know, and it was like, well, how are you willing to take accountability for this? And I was like, bro, and I remember I said this so loud because I just had this like I haven't apologized every day for like being who I am in this place, like for caring too deeply, for being too much, for speaking too loudly, especially about student issues, for focusing too much on, you know, my trademarked Titanic politic, right? Women and children first on the safety raft. Like, you know me, like, I really try to be unapologetic in my life about who I am, but I apologized every day. Every time I would say something in a meeting, I was like, sorry, you know, my nickname was the pain in the ass. So I was like, sorry, pain in the ass here again, but can we address this thing or can we talk about this thing? Which was just met with like silence and like eye rolls. And I remember, just that moment, like I haven't apologized for like existing in this way, in this like radically loving mama bear, like totally fucking messy way. But like I have so much to contribute, and reviews said that, you know, like I actually have a lot of receipts for that. But it was incredible because the leadership was taking no accountability, none, for very overt abuses, neglect, etc. And I was the one that had to take accountability. That was one of those moments where I was like, I can't do this anymore because, man, I'm tired of being vulnerable only to be like, when I name a problem, I'm treated like the problem. Just going back to that like control piece and that fear piece, it was like, well, if I can't control you, I'm going to control the narrative about you. If I can't control you, I'm going to control what people think about you. But I think for you and I both, it was like people respected us. People knew that we would show up and take the risks, right? So now you're going to try to like undermine all that. And I was like, no. Everybody has a song, right? And when I was driving over here, like to ground myself in that moment, I was playing Brother Ali all night. Because when he talks about like, I'm using my heart for what hearts are for, right? And he was talking to the police, like, you're not using your heart for what hearts are for. And he talked about like, I'm not buying fear because that's all you have left. And when I think about everything that's happening in our country, in all of our institutions and all of these systems, way too many people are operating from fear. And that's what's happening when you see like the breakup with the bromance and all the stuff that's happening with both political parties, right? Everybody's operating from the wrong place. And so where do we learn how to not operate from fear? And like, you're one of the people in my life that was like, bitch, stop operating from scarcity. That was all I ever knew. Even with a lot of like my privileges, you know, my comforts now with my family, like really doing well now in professional settings, right? Like I actually have a safety net that I never had. But in my gut, I was still so afraid and so rooted in scarcity. And unfortunately, so much of that came from and was reinforced by my career in higher education. That as long as I stayed scared, as long as I stayed in my fear or in the belief that I was not enough when really I was too much, that they could control. And I was like, no, I'm not buying that. But I didn't have a language for it, really, right? And so that's what we're trying to do here is like, we want to instill a language, because when we talk about what's happening in LA, when we talk about like the uprisings that are coming, this is because so many of us are out there planting seeds to be like, I'm not buying your fear because that's all you've got left. So that's what I'm steeping on.
Yeah, I think the piece around control is the most powerfully connected piece to that fear. It's what are you fearful of? What are you like? You are in power. You are making tons of money. What are you afraid of? What am I going to do? You know? And I think as you were speaking, part of what really kind of came up for me was how going back to that cycle of women of color in the workplace, and we'll pop a graphic in so you can see it, thinking about how at first I was welcomed, you know, and people were like, wow, she's really saying all these great things. And I really appreciate the perspective, right? And then it was like, I might steal a little bit of this just to, you know, I'm just expressing your ideas in spaces that you're not present in, right? And then it was like, well, I'm just going to take credit for it because it comes with more credibility if I say it as fill-in positional power, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, now I've gotten everything that I needed from you. So time to flip the switch, time to make everybody think XYZ about you because now I'm threatened.
Yep.
Because I rose to my position by stealing your thoughts, your ideas, your work. And this is something that happens across the board.
Yep.
Again, with the stories that we hear, I just spoke to a friend not too long ago who does not work in higher education, but was sharing about how her male supervisor often takes credit for things that she's writing. And that's like written, right? And so I'm like, the audacity to sit here and take all of my content and all of my thoughts and all of my ideas,
your magic,
that are freaking radical and wanting to build something new. Yeah. Building your career off of it and killing mine.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Shooketh.
Like we're on some next level, like this is Ursula shit.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal your voice, you know? And then like you're doing this kind of work with students all day, every day. Say you become an expert in a certain area and they're like, we're going to have all these meetings about that thing and have all these committees about that thing. And you're not invited to talk about the thing that you're doing all day, every day, that you've done all your research for your dissertation. I'm sorry, we have this committee, but you can't be on it. Or like, we're writing these grants about the thing that you're doing, but you're not invited to the planning meeting. And then all these other people are going to get paid for that grant
that you ideated.
Literally just had this with watching an interview with a president of an institution, and I was the only person saying this thing over and over again. And she said that shit in that interview. And I was like, wait, those were my words. And you're not actually trying to do that. You have no interest in doing the thing that I kept talking about. It just sounds really pretty for you to say that because you're trying to get support for this thing. It was so overt, but again, if I brought that forward, I would just be difficult. And who cares anyways?
Well, and then you get put on a performance improvement plan, right? And now all of a sudden you had stellar reviews.
Yep.
But you've complained a little too much now. Yep. And it's hitting a little close to home now. So now all of a sudden, all of these things that have been consistently happening are now a problem.
Yep.
We're going to have to, you're on warning now. You get a write-up now. You're about to get fired.
Yeah.
And again, trying to re-inculcate that fear because they need us to be fearful in order to control us. And when we don't allow that, that's when shit hits the fan and you become the problem. And they need to figure out how to eradicate,
get rid of the problem.
And God forbid you're somebody who also happens to have skill set around connecting with people who then you also help empower because now you're also making others fearless and we really cannot handle that.
Again, like Pablo Neruda told us, you can cut all the flowers, but you cannot stop spring from coming. And this is what we are bearing witness to in our institutions, in our country, in our world. It's coming. So what does it look like? We want you to steep on an abolitionist framework. There's a book by Miriam Kaba that I love so much because it's short stories, neurodivergent ADHD brain, and it's more questions than answers because that's really what this is about, right? And she talks a lot about the reality is that even if we were given the opportunity to like wipe the slate clean and create the kind of world that we want to live in, you know, like all those ideas and those politics and like that cop that lives in our brains, like all that stuff has been so programmed that we would probably replicate a lot of the same harms with the best of intention, but the impact ends up being harm. So when we're dreaming about a different world, like when you talked about it really begins with like that person in the mirror stuff. And again, most of what I learned was through community organizing where like, I made a million mistakes and I had to be accountable for that shit. I went home and cried on it and was like, damn, I showed up in some, you know, fucked up way in that moment. Where did that come from? Like, is that my like light skin, white skin superiority shit coming up? Like, that's real. Let me sit with that.
Yeah, be curious.
So just steep in it a little bit. We're steeping in the shit because again, this is part of our grief process, part of our healing process. And so much of that is just like sitting with myself, being like, okay, what are the things that maybe I could have done differently, right? And what are the things that I want to share so that other people who are sitting in that aren't gaslighting themselves and calling themselves crazy for everything in your body telling you that like something is wrong.
Yeah. And it also reminded me of the quote, and I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting her name, but I will find it and plop it in here. But the quote is, you know, talking about how oppression's job is to like stop your imagination. And so I guess going back to that like independent work that we all need to do, how many of you check in with your little selves from way back in the day, right? Most of us, I think, are taught to compartmentalize that little version of ourselves. We know that they went through a lot of things and, you know, sometimes it's normal things that we're going through, but our baby undeveloped brains can process what that means, right? Yep. And so then we create these pathways in our brains that literally are cemented there. They can be jackhammered and repaved and whatever, but that requires work, right? And so how much do we prevent ourselves from being able to just imagine what life could have looked like? How am I and the work that I'm doing helping to heal and shepherd little Anna?
Yeah.
Right. And like, what does me doing my work to heal and to process all of this trauma, how does that contribute to our greater community? Also just saw, I think it was a TikTok video, and she said, if you work like a machine, they'll treat you like one. And I was like, damn, that hits hard because it comes back to like, what am I allowing?
How is my worth so wrapped up in my productivity, right? Because again, of all that messaging that like I've internalized. And I was one of those people that was like, you know, running from myself, running from young motherhood, like just running from so much trauma. Couldn't get into my body because my body had been brutalized in so many ways,
and it's
right?
not safe sometimes.
And so I was like, you know, overworking. I would leave work and I would go and do community work for like hours on hours. And I would like build these big things and none of that was healthy, right? Those are actually the things that are killing, especially folks of color, especially bodies of culture. And I think so much of what we're taught and so much of the ways we're acculturated, starting with, you know, our K through 12 system, right? It's like, sit down, shut up, and stuff it. I want to live in a life affirming world. I want to live in a life affirming system. I want to work in a life affirming place. Does that life affirming place actually exist? And
not yet.
It doesn't.
Not yet.
So can I tolerate, because I've got all this stuff in my body that I'm trying to heal from these, you know, 25 years, like I spent half of my life in higher education, you know, so
she's not 50 though.
No.
It wasn't, she's not, the math ain't mathin'.
The math ain't mathin'. A few years.
Close.
But like, what does that mean when I'm still trying to like survive in the context of capital?
And again, understanding that it's not going to be perfect. Nothing is ever going to be perfect because humans are not
And that's
perfect.
white supremacy culture, right?
Exactly.
Perfectionism.
Exactly. And, you know, again, I can only speak from my own experience, but as somebody who has done a lot of this work and has really been intentional about moving through the pain and moving through the trauma and trying to like process it so that it doesn't become something that then affects those around me.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that's what happens, right? I still find myself struggling through that.
Yeah.
And that's why I keep seeing my therapist, you know, because sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm tired. I'm going to rest today. And then that little thing comes in my brain and it's like, well, it's a work day.
Yeah.
How are you going to prove your worth?
Yeah.
And so like, how do we hold the both and?
Yeah.
And I think that skill, if we can develop that skill more to just recognize that it's not either or, it's never, okay, I won't say never. Sometimes it is, right?
Yeah.
Like you're dead or you're not dead. That's what it is. But holding the complexity of life and understanding that the majority of the time we live in the gray. It's very rarely stark black, stark white.
Yeah.
You know, it's very gray and messy and sometimes hard to see and navigate through. And so my hope, I guess, when I think about what repair and transformation could look like, it's to just create a place where mistakes are normalized and accepted. And people are allowed to be vulnerable and put out there like, I need help. So we can, as a community, come and fucking love on you and make sure that you get what you need to succeed. For me, that's what that looks like. People who actually care about each other, who are not in competition with each other and really see themselves as part of the same struggle. Regardless of what your actual stance is. I mean, look at what's happening right now. I'm not going to lie. The breakup between Carrot Man and Robot Man.
Alien versus Predator.
Those who should not be named.
Living for the memes.
I am loving that. And I also want to take this opportunity to remind you how quickly they turned on each other. Immediately. I'm just talking about in this moment, like not only did they break up and then just stay silent and not say anything, they started talking shit about each other and spilling all the tea, right? And being like, well, he hasn't released the file because he's in them, you know? And now they're like, oh, cancel his contract with the government and also deport his ass because we think he's here illegally. And how quickly, like, that's the energy that we shift to rather than like, sometimes you're going to have fallouts with people and that's okay. But like, that doesn't mean that we have to work to create hostility for you.
Yeah. And can I go back to like, again, Titanic, right? How much of this is grounded in patriarchy, right? How long have we been told the women are too emotional for leadership, right? And these men are so damn emotional, bleeding all over everybody who didn't cut them. Again, it's all about power. It's all about ego, right? So when we're talking about leadership, how do you find a place where you can feel the id, you can feel the ego, you can acknowledge it, you can sit with it, and you can fight it, not with the other, narc that you're embattled with, but with yourself. And how can we create those life affirming workplaces where like, we're sitting with our students, with our community members, our friends and being like, yo, like, yeah, I see what's going on. I see you're struggling. I can't help you if you don't ask for help. What does it mean when we keep meeting with people and we have all these friends, these colleagues that are asking for help, which is such a hard thing to do, where we want to hire people who have those lived experiences that mirror our students. And again, our next episode, we're going to get into that mental health piece where it's like the vicarious trauma. Like, what does it mean for me to be sitting with little Chelsea who's asking for help? And then I go to somebody that I trust and I ask for help on behalf of that student. And again, I know I know that all the resources are available. I know there's money. I know there's all these things. And I either get stonewalled where like, man, you can't even answer an email. And the student keeps coming back to me like, we talked about moral distress. We talked about moral injury, right? That I'm like looking at this person. I'm failing this person, not because we don't have all the tools, all the resources. So it goes back to that bigger question, that bigger problem of priorities, right? Higher education leaders, what could you be doing with all that power, with all those resources, instead of paying millions of dollars for lawyers to defend what you know to be true, like to fight that, right? To bury it, to suppress it, no matter the human cost, no matter the cost
to you as an
and to you,
individual.
like you're hurting too. This isn't us trying to even other, right? This is about en la cash, like tú eres mi otro yo. Like if I do harm to you, I do harm to myself, you know?
Mhm.
And I think you and I are in this struggle right now with that accountability piece. Like, what does that look like when we're trying to publicly hold some people accountable in our lives, right? Or ask questions about accountability in this space. You know, what do I do when that ego comes up, when I'm there trying to defend like who I am and the things that I did? That's literally all that's required is like, I'm not buying fear just because that's all you've got left. And like, am I using my heart for what hearts are for? Like just that question, right? Am I using my heart for what hearts are for? She and I right now, like this has been a very scary thing, like to be witnessed this way. Like we're usually people bearing witness to others. And, you know, I can get up on a platform in front of thousands of people and like talk my shit. But to do this with you in a very intimate way publicly is hard. So literally when we're thinking about like, stop policing our imaginations and what's possible, we're just asking all of us to sit in the truth of what the current context is telling us through your stories, through the articles, through the lawsuits. We can't lie about what's happening. And when we think about like the resistance, like how do we form a human chain? We're asking you to like literally lock arms with us in a human chain to say no more harm to people, especially people in the margins.
At least no more
in higher education. Harm. Yeah, like we're going to cause harm, but stop doubling down on the harm. Let's acknowledge the harm. Let's talk about it. Let's sit with it. Because literally all of our liberation is connected. And again, to the leaders that are listening to this, I hope that your ego is not controlling the way that you hear this. I hope you can hear us like with your heart to say, again, when we say we're here to transform, like that shit is real. That's our intention and our impact. We can take accountability for if there's something that we do that's harmful. We're here to do that publicly, right? But like, we hope that you can let this sit in to your bones. There was that meme that you and I keep talking about because we've oscillated so much from like, you know, little Anna like wants safety, right? Teenage Anna wants justice. Adult Anna wants peace. And I think for so many of us, like that's where we're at. Like I'm oscillating between all of those identities and all of those Chelseas on a daily basis. And you probably are too, even if you don't know it, even if you're not in tune with that part of your experience. Get tuned into it because it's the only way that we're ever going to be well.
And that, I mean, that really is kind of what our goal is with this time together, is to hopefully show up in a way that models the messiness and that like, look, we're still out here surviving.
Yeah.
Maybe thriving at some point, you know? And like Chelsea said, this is like terrifying in a lot of ways because we are sharing a lot of personal stories that, you know, people are watching, and sometimes people are watching with ill will and ill intent. And we rebuke that. Not here, Satan.
Tarot, we've got our
evil eye everywhere. Like get out of here, you know? And like take a moment to think about when you have those thoughts that are encouraging you to send negativity outside of yourself toward others. Like, what is that? Sit with that.
Yeah.
Why is that where my head is going? Why is that what I want to do? Why is me feeling inferior or unwell or, you know, less than, having the imposter syndrome, whatever it is that you want to call it? When I have that moment of like reality check, I fucked up. Why is my knee-jerk reaction to be like, well, she did it too.
Yeah.
Or he did it too.
Yeah.
And they did it worse.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, take a moment, take a step back, breathe. We don't breathe enough intentionally. I mean, our bodies, as long as they're able to, like that's an unconscious thing that is just happening. But when you bring intentionality into the breath, it's life-giving. And ultimately, like that's what I want to see. I want to see people actually in tune with their bodies, listening to the things that they are created to tell us.
Yeah.
Like we are not a head attached to a body as two separate entities. They are inextricably connected.
Yeah.
They cannot be separated. If you get beheaded, it's over.
Yeah.
You know, the body cannot survive without the brain and the brain cannot survive without the body. Yep. So we need to find a way to meld those two together and allow space for us to be able to show up as our full selves, the way we talk about often in higher ed, but really mean it. And allow the messiness to exist, allow the space for people to hold us accountable and to hold others accountable because nobody's above the accountability. If we can get to a place where we normalize accountability in this framework of like, this is what liberation looks like, this is what healing looks like, that could be so transformational.
Absolutely. And thinking about, again, I feel like, you know, Anna was the one that kept being like, I'm like, well, you know, who are we to? And she's like, bitch, who are we not to? You know, like what, also just like interrogating your own self-doubt, right? And the feedback we've been getting from this so far, we just started. And the feedback we've been getting is so beautiful and so affirming. Again, not because it's perfect, but I think because it's imperfect, because we're just up here being messy, and that hopefully you see some of yourself in the stories that we're telling or in us, again, in our messiness. We really hope this encourages you to again, lean into your own shit. Sit again, loving just Dolce right now. And even when Homegirl like came to her in the song and was like, you know, I've noticed like there's something going on with you. And even when Dolce has to breathe, like, you know, if that's what your breathing looks like, that's okay. Like that tells you that there's something that's misaligned. And I think that was the struggle, is like acknowledging the misalignment, sitting with it. And this ended up being a two-parter because it needed to be. And I think today we sat with the intention of like, okay, we're going to let this conversation go where it needs to. And it went exactly where it needed to go. So please, we want to keep doing this. We want this to be a thing because we feel like it's necessary in our ecosystem. And here comes the pitch. Again, that like requires, hopefully, like y'all will share it. You'll submit your stories. You can do them anonymously. We're not here to cause more harm. Please share this because you never know. There could be one thing that we said today that could be life affirming for somebody who's really, really struggling. And that's all like, you know, little Chelsea and little Anna want, is for somebody to hear something that affirms your right to exist, affirms your worth, again, not connected to your productivity, and interrogates how much of that is gendered, how much of that is classed, right? And we're going to get into all that. We're going to do deep dives on that stuff because we can't talk about this shit unless we talk about power, all going back to power. And so thank you for joining us
for this part of the discussion. We're going to keep building on it. And yeah, like Chelsea said, we hope that you are enjoying the content and that you get more confident with engaging. We know it can be a little scary to engage with, you know, your personal social media and, you know, how people might receive that. But again, we're trying to create a culture shift toward just more authenticity and toward creating opportunity for people to ask for help and then receive that help. Yeah, we hope that you'll join us in that. And part of what brings us to that is our Raise Our Mug sections. So this week, we are raising our mug to all of the folks who are refusing to co-sign the institutional chaos. We know how hard that is. We know the risk that you take every time that you do that, in whatever way you do that. And those of us who are harmed by the institution and the system wouldn't survive without it.
Yeah.
So thank you to those of you fighting the good fight.
Absolutely. And I think figuring out, you know, that locus of control part, right? Where we talked about like informal leaders, when we talked about people, in really messy spaces trying to create just more life affirming context. I want to raise my mug to all those people. And I don't think I can say your names, but people who were, say, working in a place like human resources, which, were telling me like, I'm sorry. They knew that what was happening wasn't right. And they knew they didn't have the power to really do anything about it. And I know they tried.
And ultimately got punished.
They got punished. And so thinking about, like, we get so fixated on like the outcome, right? We don't expect people in those systems that lack that institutional power, right, to be able to fix any of it. But the fact that you were human and that you acknowledged me as a human that was valuable and that said sorry, I think that kind of means more than people know.
Especially when you're being painted as like crazy and validated constantly.
Yeah.
Having one person to just be like, don't tell anyone I told you that. You're not crazy.
Yeah. And
I'm like, okay, thank you. I just needed somebody to validate me for a second because I started to believe it.
So be that person, like be that bitch that's like, hey, man, I'm so sorry. And you went wrong because you really could. And again, I don't say this in a way that's hyperbolic. Like, you really could save a life by doing that. Don't diminish how powerful that is in the context of you lacking like institutional power. That may be where your power lies. Thank you. Like, really, thank you. And we're going to send this to you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And again, part of what we want to do is highlight and name the people who really are showing up in these ways. I have a couple people that I actually want to name. One person is Joaquin Becerra. Hopefully he doesn't watch this because then his head will get all big. But I really appreciate the way he shows up as a man with more institutional power in his humanity. And that is always the grounding framework that he's approaching everything in his life from. And it's so refreshing to see somebody putting that learning to practice and really like validating people and trying to teach people and not just throwing people away because they've made a mistake or because, insert whatever rationale you want to give for that. So thank you for showing up in that humanity. And then I also want to say thank you to my now friend, former colleague, Pam Scott, who we had a rough transition initially because I went into her job that she was just doing a month before I started, and then she became the supervisor of said job. And she and I are very different. And it took us a second to like find our groove and find the communication and for her to be able to like release what she thought the right thing to do was in terms of like how things ran and, her own experience. And for me to not just sit and be like, I'm not going to listen to you because you're annoying me. Sorry, Pam. And you want me to just do everything the way you do, but I'm not you. So it's not going to land that way. Right. And so both of us taking the opportunity to like, just sit back, not be reactive and say like, okay, yeah, she's doing things differently. She wants me to do things differently. Is there a way that we can like talk through this and create opportunities for learning and for growth? And we did. And now she is a great friend of mine who I treasure. And so again, I'm grateful that there have been folks who have been committed to doing that self-work that then allows you to be a better person in community. So I'm raising my mug to you both. Thank you for showing up.
Yep. I'm going to raise my mug. I have a few, but I want to raise my mug to my nug. That's a different segment. That's the after party. I want to raise my mug to our friend, Dr. Napoleon, because when I think about leadership and I think about women in leadership and women showing up, with all the credentials, with all the language and taking risks and being vulnerable. And like, I'll never forget watching like academic senate meetings and having Dr. Napoleon, who has, a PhD in chemistry, which was a big deal, breastfeed on camera. Other people were probably uncomfortable because, again, patriarchal bullshit. But like, for me, that was like, wow, that was so beautifully, radically life affirming as a mother, as a person who, was supporting mothers in so many ways, right? And hopefully she's going to come on, and I'm not going to tell any of her story, but a woman who shined a light on a lot of things, again, things that were very gendered, tried to create safety for other women in many ways, and was really harmed in that process. And so I want to raise my mug to her, and all the work that she's done to heal too has just been amazing to bear witness to. And a lot of times that means letting some shit go.
It was beautiful to see.
It's beautiful to see, and it's been a beautiful model for me. So I'm choosing to raise my mug to her leadership today.
Yeah. And we also want to ask you to tag people in our social media. We'll be posting Raise Your Mug thread on Instagram probably. Yes. And we'd love for you guys to tag those who are doing this and modeling this, because again, more visibility creates a widening of this showing up in our spaces. Yes. So
Raise Your Mug Mondays. It's going to be a thing. Raise Your Mug Mondays, because Mondays ain't shit. So let's kick it off in a positive way, in a loving way, in an affirming way, when somebody's dragging themselves into that crusty office that, you know, is the place that is harming them, for them to, you know, maybe log on, not during their work hours, but for them to log on and see that, like, you're affirming them, that you see them. Again, that it, sometimes it really is that simple. So please,
small, but so meaningful,
tag the homie that's doing it right and let them know, because there's a good chance that they don't even know that they're doing it right, or they don't know that you're watching.
Yes.
And so many of us, people are bearing witness to us without us knowing, or without, again, you're just getting beat up every time you show up as your full self. And be like, no, I see you and I like that. Keep doing that shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you can't tag them because we know things are messy, then tell them. At least tell them.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for that.
Love y'all.
And so we'll have one final reminder. You can join us in submitting your stories to be featured on our podcast. And you can do that at tinyurl.com/tspillinghe.
And you can and you should subscribe to the pod on YouTube and Spotify. Follow us on IG, TikTok, BlueSky, and engage. Again, please just don't leave us hanging out there in the silence. Silence is violence. Stay rooted,
stay radical,
and stay resisting.
Bye.